Every heroic story you've repeated at dinner, every famous quote you've dropped in an argument, every legendary moment you learned in school, most of it is mythology wearing a textbook. Here's the actual record. 1. You have been told your entire life that Napoleon Bonaparte was a tiny, rage-fueled man whose infamous aggression was really just a psychological overcorrection for his humiliating lack of height. And that's where the phrase Napoleon complex comes from, a term the entire English-speaking world now treats as established historical fact. It's not. Napoleon was not short. He stood approximately 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 7 inches, which was perfectly average for a Frenchman of his era. The confusion comes from a straightforward unit conversion error that nobody bothered to correct. Napoleon's height was recorded as 5 feet 2 inches in French units called pouces, which convert to approximately 5 feet 6 or 7 inches in imperial measurement. British propagandists either didn't know the difference or didn't care. The cartoonist James Gilray deliberately drew Napoleon as a tiny, tantrum-throwing child to mock and politically destabilize him during wartime. That was state-sponsored ridicule dressed up as biography. His troops called him Le Petit Caporal, meaning the little corporal, which was a term of affection referencing his early enlisted rank, not a commentary on his physical stature. His imperial guard had a minimum height requirement of 5 feet 7 inches, and Napoleon frequently stood among them in official portraits, appearing shorter by comparison. A visual illusion that hardened into historical gospel across 2 centuries. Multiple contemporary accounts from people who actually met him describe him as average height or even well-built. The concept of Napoleon complex as a formal psychological framework wasn't even proposed until 1926, over a century after the myth was already cemented by enemy cartoons. You have been psychologically diagnosing a man based on wartime propaganda drawn by his opponents. That is the historical equivalent of letting opposing counsel write the verdict. 2. You have almost certainly repeated the story that Albert Einstein was a hopeless student who famously failed mathematics as a child. Proof that conventional education can't recognize genius and therefore your own academic struggles are secretly signs of hidden brilliance waiting to be discovered. This is not true. Einstein never failed mathematics. He mastered calculus before the age of 15 and was exceptional at both mathematics and physics from a very young age. The myth originates from a Swiss grading system that ran in the opposite direction from what most people expect. In Switzerland, 6 was the highest grade and 1 was the lowest, the reverse of some other European systems. When Einstein's report cards circulated internationally, observers misread his top scores as near failures, and the error compounded itself across decades of retelling. Einstein himself addressed this directly, stating that he had mastered differential and integral calculus before turning 15. He did fail an entrance exam, the one for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic known as ET Zurich, but not because of his science. He was 2 years younger than the standard admission age, and his French language scores were weak. His mathematics and physics scores were exceptional. He was encouraged by the institution's principal to attend a preparatory school in Aarau for 1 year, which he did, and he was admitted to ETH at age 16 the following year. That is not the trajectory of someone failing at mathematics. After graduation, his struggles were real but entirely different. He couldn't find academic employment because professors found him abrasive, not because his work was weak. The myth has been enthusiastically recycled by motivational speakers and self-help books for decades because it is emotionally useful, not because it is accurate. Einstein didn't need your consolation. He needed a job reference. 3. You grew up with the story that Christopher Columbus bravely sailed west to prove the Earth was round against a church and a scientific establishment that stubbornly believed it was flat, a lone visionary against the ignorance of his age. There is almost nothing historically accurate in that sentence. Educated Europeans in 1492 already knew the Earth was spherical. Nobody was arguing about the shape. The actual debate Columbus faced was about the size of the ocean between Europe and Asia, and whether it was small enough to cross by ship with the supplies available. His critics were correct. The distance was far greater than Columbus believed. Greek mathematician Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy around 240 BCE, nearly 1700 years before Columbus set sail. Medieval European scholars, including theologians working within the Catholic Church, accepted a spherical Earth as established fact. Thomas Aquinas referenced it explicitly. The flat Earth opposition to Columbus was largely invented by American author Washington Irving in his 1828 fictionalized biography of Columbus, which mixed fabrication with historical fact and became the dominant popular account for over a century. Irving's flat Earth villain story was then adopted by 19th century science advocates who wanted a compelling adversary, specifically the Church, to contrast against heroic scientific progress. Columbus himself died convinced he had reached Asia. He was catastrophically wrong about the geography and only survived because an uncharted continent happened to be positioned in his path. He never reached the North American mainland. He completed 4 voyages without setting foot there. Columbus didn't prove the Earth was round. He proved that being confidently wrong about the size of an ocean can still accidentally make you famous, which is the most accidentally American story ever told, given that he never reached America either. 4. You have heard the charming story that Abraham Lincoln, pressed for time and casually brilliant, scribbled one of the most celebrated speeches in human history on the back of an envelope during a train ride to Gettysburg, proof that genius works on deadline and inspiration strikes wherever it finds you. There is no envelope, there never was. Lincoln prepared the Gettysburg Address carefully over multiple days, and the evidence is not subtle about this. 5 handwritten drafts of the speech survive. They are called the Bancroft, Bliss, Everett, Hay, and Nicolay copies, each showing deliberate revision and careful compositional thought. These are not the artifacts of a man improvising on a train. Lincoln's own secretary, John Nicolay, who traveled with him to Gettysburg, explicitly stated that Lincoln had the speech substantially written before boarding the train. Lincoln was not even the primary invited speaker at the ceremony. That was Edward Everett, a famous orator who spoke for 2 full hours before Lincoln rose. Lincoln's brief remarks were almost an afterthought on the program. Contemporary accounts from people who observed Lincoln on the train describe him as reading, not writing. The envelope myth began circulating decades after the address was delivered and gained momentum because it was a better story. The image of genius improvisation is more romantically satisfying than diligent preparation. Lincoln was known throughout his career as a meticulous preparer of speeches. His Cooper Union Address, which helped secure him the Republican presidential nomination, was extensively researched and drafted over months. The man who carefully prepared one of the greatest speeches in Democratic history has been immortalized as a guy who winged it on a train. Apparently, even Abraham Lincoln couldn't escape the cultural myth that hard work is less impressive than last-minute inspiration. 5. You likely carry the image of Marie Curie as a tragic, innocent victim of her own discoveries. A woman who blissfully carried radioactive isotopes in her coat pockets without understanding the danger, oblivious to the forces destroying her from the inside while she changed the world. Curie knew radiation caused biological damage. She documented symptoms in herself and in her colleagues. She kept working anyway because she judged the scientific work worth the personal cost, which is an entirely different and considerably more unsettling story. By the early 1900s, radiation burns and radiation sickness were documented across the research community. Curie noted chronic fatigue, damaged fingertips, and deteriorating vision in her personal notebooks. During World War I, she established mobile X-ray units for field hospitals called Petites Curies, and trained operators to use them, specifically cautioning those operators about the risks of excessive exposure. She was not warning others about a danger she herself didn't understand. Her notebooks remain radioactive to this day and are stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. Researchers who wish to examine them must sign a liability waiver before doing so. She carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes, partly for demonstrative purposes, and partly because containment technology in her era was primitive, not because she was unaware of the hazard. The scientific community of the early 20th century lacked a complete understanding of cumulative long-term radiation damage, but Curie was operating at the frontier of what was knowable, not in comfortable ignorance beneath it. She died from aplastic anemia in 1934 as a consequence of decades of exposure. That was a sacrifice made with increasing awareness of the cost. Curie wasn't an oblivious martyr. She was a scientist who understood the risk, calculated it against the value of the work, and kept going, which is a level of professional commitment most people couldn't fathom from the safety of their ergonomic office chairs. 6. You know the story. Isaac Newton was sitting peacefully under an apple tree when the fruit struck him on the skull, and, in one cartoon instant, the entire theory of universal gravitation was born in a single dramatic moment of physical comedy. No apple hit Newton on the head. The apple story is a simplified retelling of a far more gradual and complicated intellectual process, and Newton himself described it differently. The earliest written account comes from Newton's friend William Stukeley, who wrote in 1752, 25 years after Newton's death, that Newton mentioned seeing an apple fall from a tree nearby, which prompted reflection on why objects always fall perpendicular to the ground rather than sideways or upward. Newton's own accounts describe the apple falling near him, not striking him. The detail of the apple hitting his head was added later by subsequent retellings because it was funnier and more memorable. Newton's gravitational theory developed over roughly 20 years of sustained mathematical work, not a single afternoon under a tree. His Principia Mathematica was published in 1687. He was working through ideas first explored by Galileo, Kepler, and Robert Hooke. And the apple, if it contributed anything, was a prompt for questions he was already actively considering, not the origin of an entirely new idea. Hooke actually accused Newton of plagiarizing his own earlier descriptions of inverse square gravitational force, a dispute that became bitter, personal, and professionally damaging to both men. Voltaire is largely responsible for popularizing the apple story, having reportedly heard it from Newton's niece, meaning a second-hand account told by a French satirist became the foundational biography of modern physics. 20 years of mathematics, disputed credit, and a bitter international rivalry got compressed into a man getting bonked by fruit. Science communicators have been chasing that level of oversimplification ever since. 7. You have been told since grade school that George Washington, first president and father of a nation, famously wore dentures carved from wood, a charming, humanizing detail that has appeared in children's books, classroom posters, and trivia nights for more than 2 centuries without anyone apparently stopping to ask what the evidence actually shows. Washington's dentures were never made of wood, not once, not a single documented set. The materials used were, if anything, significantly more unsettling than timber. Washington's surviving dentures, several complete sets still exist and have been examined, were constructed from a combination of human teeth, cow teeth, horse teeth, ivory from hippopotamuses, ivory from elephants, and metal alloys. He began losing his natural teeth in his 20s and had only one natural tooth remaining by the time of his first inauguration. His dental pain was severe and chronic throughout his entire presidency, and he wrote about it extensively in personal letters, calling it a source of constant suffering. His dentures were custom made by Dr. John Greenwood, one of the leading dental practitioners in early America, using the best materials available at the time, none of which was wood. The wooden teeth myth likely originated from the appearance of his ivory dentures over time, since ivory yellows and develops a carved, grain-like texture that can superficially resemble stained wood. Washington's tight-lipped, sunken-cheeked appearance in his official portraits, including the image that appears on American currency, is largely a consequence of chronically ill-fitting prosthetics pressing against his jaw, not an expression of stoic, presidential dignity. America's founding father wore a mouth assembled from animal ivory and other people's extracted teeth, and somehow history decided that wooden dentures was the more memorable story. The truth was right there, and it was genuinely more unsettling. 8. You think of Cleopatra as Egyptian, the most famous Egyptian in all of history, an icon of ancient power and sophistication whose image is inseparable from the culture of the Nile. She is listed without question among Egypt's great rulers. And she was almost certainly of Macedonian Greek descent, the product of a dynasty founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, who likely spoke Egyptian as a second or possibly third language. Cleopatra Setem was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, established in 305 BCE by Ptolemy Soter, a Macedonian Greek general from Alexander's own army. The dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years before Cleopatra's reign. The Ptolemies were notoriously insular in their marriage practices, frequently wedding siblings and close relatives specifically to preserve their Macedonian bloodline. Cleopatra's ancestry was overwhelmingly Greek, not Egyptian. Ancient sources credit her with being the first Ptolemaic ruler who actually bothered to learn the Egyptian language. Her predecessors governed a country whose native tongue they never spoke. She reportedly also spoke Parthian, Hebrew, Ethiopian, Aramaic, and several other languages, which is consistent with a sophisticated Hellenistic court education, not an indigenous Egyptian upbringing. The ethnicity of her mother is undocumented, and some historians have speculated about potential African ancestry on that side, but no primary historical evidence supports a firm conclusion. Modern representations of Cleopatra as ethnically Egyptian are a cultural projection backward, partly originating from the visual language she strategically adopted. Egyptian religious iconography, Egyptian titles, Egyptian ritual, for political purposes to legitimize her rule in the eyes of her subjects. She adopted Egyptian identity as a governing tool. Cleopatra wasn't an Egyptian queen who happened to speak Greek. She was a Greek queen who made herself Egyptian because it was good politics. 9. You know that Vincent van Gogh, in a fit of tortured genius madness, sliced off his entire ear and delivered it to a woman. The definitive act of romantic artistic self-destruction that became the universal shorthand for the suffering of creative genius across every parody, reference, and coffee mug that followed. Van Gogh cut off only a portion of his lower earlobe, not the entire ear. And the full circumstances of that night in Arles in December 1888 remain genuinely disputed by serious historians. The primary account held for over a century was that Van Gogh, following a violent argument with fellow painter Paul Gauguin, severed part of his left ear and delivered it to a woman named Rachel at a nearby establishment. Art historians Martin Bailey and Hans Kaufmann have separately proposed, based on archival research, that the cut may have been substantially more extensive, possibly the full outer ear, though no definitive scholarly consensus has been reached. A book published in 2009 by Kaufmann and Rita Weldigans went further, arguing that Gauguin, a skilled fencer, may have actually severed Van Gogh's ear during a physical altercation, with both men subsequently agreeing to a cover story. The woman who received the ear was identified by researchers in 2016 as a young woman named Gabrielle Berlatier, not a prostitute as previously assumed, but a cleaner at the establishment. Van Gogh painted himself twice after the incident wearing a bandage, but both portraits show the right ear bandaged rather than the left, likely because he painted using a mirror. His documented mental health episodes are now associated by researchers with conditions including temporal lobe epilepsy and acute intermittent porphyria, not simple madness. The most famous act of artistic self-destruction in Western cultural memory is wrong on almost every detail. The amount removed, the recipient's identity, and possibly even the person who did the cutting. 10. You may have been taught that Julius Caesar's very name is the origin of the surgical procedure. Proof that he entered the world through a dramatic emergency delivery that gave history one of its most satisfying etymological coincidences. It's not true on any level. Caesar was almost certainly not born by caesarean section, and the procedure he supposedly lent his name to is not where the name comes from either. In the ancient world, caesarean sections were performed exclusively when the mother had already died or was actively dying. The procedure existed to save the infant, not the mother. Caesar's mother, Aurelia, was famously, demonstrably alive and deeply involved in Caesar's upbringing and education for decades after his birth. She is documented in historical sources as a central figure in his early life and intellectual formation. A maternal survival following a caesarean section in the ancient world, without anesthesia, without antiseptic, and with near zero documented survival rates for the mother, would have been extraordinary enough to appear in contemporary records. It does not. The historian Pliny the Elder mentions in his Natural History that Caesar's name may derive from a distant ancestor who was born by the procedure, not Caesar himself, but even this etymology is one of several competing theories. Other proposed origins include the Latin word Caesares, meaning thick hair, Caesia, meaning gray eyes, or a reference to an ancestor who killed an elephant in battle. None has been definitively established. The neat etymological story of the surgical procedure, and the famous man sharing a name, was likely propagated in medieval and early modern scholarship because it was satisfying, not because it was sourced. The myth doesn't just contradict the evidence, it requires Caesar's mother to be dead, and she simply refused to cooperate with the story. 11. You probably attribute the theory of evolution entirely to Charles Darwin, a lone genius whose observations in the Galapagos Islands produced a single earth-shattering insight that overturned centuries of established thought in one remarkable book. Darwin didn't invent evolution, didn't originate natural selection working alone, and didn't even arrive at the theory through the Galapagos in the way the legend presents. The concept of species changing over time, transmutation, had been circulating in European scientific circles for decades before Darwin published anything. His own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, wrote about it in the 1790s. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed a formal theory of biological evolution in 1809, 50 years before Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Alfred Russel Wallace independently developed the theory of natural selection while working in the Malay archipelago, and sent Darwin a letter describing his conclusions in 1858. Their papers were jointly presented to the Linnean Society that same year. Darwin received the dominant historical credit, primarily because his subsequent book was more comprehensive, more rigorously evidenced, and better written than anything Wallace produced, not because the idea was exclusively his. Darwin didn't even fully recognize the significance of the Galapagos finches during his actual visit to the islands. He failed to properly label which specimen came from which island. He reconstructed the argument later with considerable assistance from the ornithologist John Gould. He sat on his core theory for over 20 years before publishing, partly from anxiety about the social and religious fallout, and Wallace's letter essentially forced his hand. On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, doesn't use the word evolution until the 6th edition and barely mentions human beings at all. Darwin is credited with the destination. The journey had considerably more passengers. 12. You were taught that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, a singular act of American genius that illuminated the modern world and rightfully placed him among history's great civilization changers. Edison did not invent the light bulb. He invented a commercially practical, durable version of a technology that already existed in multiple forms, and then built the infrastructure to sell it at scale. Which is genuinely impressive, but is not the same claim. English inventor Humphrey Davy demonstrated the first electric arc lamp in 1802, over 75 years before Edison's famous patent. Warren de la Rue demonstrated an enclosed platinum filament light bulb in 1840. Joseph Swan in England was publicly demonstrating working incandescent bulbs by 1878, 1 year before Edison's patent, and received his British patent before Edison received his American one. Edison and Swan were eventually compelled to form a joint company called Ediswan in Britain, specifically because Swan's prior claims were legally valid and could not be ignored. Edison's actual contributions were significant and genuinely transformative. He developed a longer-lasting carbon filament, identified a more suitable vacuum environment for the bulb, and, most critically, designed and built an entire electrical distribution system to make the bulb commercially useful at scale, including dynamos, cables, and electrical metering systems. That last achievement may have been more consequential than the bulb itself. Edison held over 1,000 patents, most of which were improvements and systematizations of existing ideas produced by a large team of researchers working at his Menlo Park laboratory, a prototype industrial research operation. Edison was a brilliant engineer and a ruthless businessman, which was more than enough. He didn't light up the world, he figured out how to charge people for light, which is a completely different and arguably more impactful achievement. 13. You know Richard III primarily through Shakespeare's portrait of a physically grotesque scheming villain who murdered his own young nephews in the Tower of London to steal the English throne. A psychological monster whose hunched body reflected his corrupted soul and whose name became synonymous with Tudor-era treachery. Richard's reputation was almost entirely constructed by Tudor propaganda, written by people whose employers needed him to be a monster, and the physical deformity and the murdered nephews are both far more historically complicated than the story allows. Richard III's remains were discovered beneath a Leicester car park in 2012. Analysis of the skeleton confirmed scoliosis of the spine, a lateral curvature that would have caused one shoulder to sit higher than the other. Not the grotesque hunchback described by Tudor sources, and certainly not the monstrous physical deformity that Shakespeare's play requires as a visual metaphor for evil. The primary literary source for Richard's villainy is a Thomas More's biography, written while More served the Tudor court, the family that had defeated Richard in battle and needed him to be historically monstrous to justify their own seizure of the throne. Shakespeare's Richard III drew directly from Tudor-commissioned chronicles and was written and performed during the reign of Elizabeth I, granddaughter of the man who had Richard killed at Bosworth Field. The fate of the so-called princes in the Tower, Richard's nephews, is genuinely unresolved. No contemporary source confirms their murder. Multiple historical suspects exist, including Henry Stafford and Henry VII himself. Richard's actual brief reign included genuine legal reforms, the introduction of bail and improvements to property rights. He was a complicated medieval king who made ruthless political moves, exactly like every medieval king who preceded him. But he lost, and losing in the 15th century meant Shakespeare got to write your permanent record. 14. You have probably absorbed the narrative of Nikola Tesla as a genius systematically erased from history. A man who died alone, penniless, and deliberately forgotten by corrupt forces that stole his work, his credit, and his rightful legacy, leaving him to expire in a hotel room while the world looked away. Tesla did die in a hotel room with significant outstanding debts, and real injustices were done to him. But the systematic erasure narrative conceals a more complicated truth, including decisions Tesla himself made that contributed substantially to where he ended up. Tesla lived in the Hotel New Yorker for the last 10 years of his life, with his bills partially subsidized by the Westinghouse Corporation out of loyalty to their prior business relationship. This is not the picture of a man abandoned by the world. His financial decline was partly self-inflicted. He made a voluntary decision to tear up his royalty contract with Westinghouse during a period of financial crisis for the company, surrendering a fortune that would have made him extraordinarily wealthy. He spent enormous personal resources on the Wardenclyffe Tower project, a wireless power transmission system, which investors declined to continue funding after Guglielmo Marconi's radio success made the business case collapse. That was a commercial decision, not a conspiracy. Tesla did receive recognition during his lifetime. He was awarded the Edison Medal in 1917, and the unit of magnetic flux density was internationally named the Tesla in 1960. The FBI seized his papers after his death in January 1943, citing wartime national security concerns. Most were eventually returned to Serbian custody. Tesla was a real genius who made real sacrifices and suffered genuine injustices. The internet repaid him by turning him into a fictional superhero, which is its own form of disrespect to a man who deserved accurate credit rather than a mythology. 15. You likely think of Abraham Lincoln as a lifelong, principled opponent of slavery who fought the Civil War specifically to free enslaved people and stood consistently on the right side of history from his earliest days in politics. The great emancipator, fixed in his convictions from the beginning. Lincoln's views on slavery, race, and emancipation evolved dramatically and uncomfortably across his political career, and his earlier positions would disturb many of the people who most fervently invoke his legacy today. In the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, some of the most celebrated in American political history, Lincoln stated explicitly, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." His primary stated war aim at the start of the Civil War was preserving the Union, not ending slavery. In an 1862 letter to the newspaper editor Horace Greeley, he wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 freed enslaved people only in Confederate states actively in rebellion, not in loyal border states where Lincoln held the legal authority to act. It was simultaneously a moral declaration and a military strategy, and the distinction matters enormously. Lincoln seriously entertained and promoted colonization schemes, proposals to relocate freed black Americans to Central America or Africa, well into the war years. His views shifted visibly, particularly after meetings with Frederick Douglass and witnessing the performance of black Union soldiers in combat. By 1865, he was publicly supporting limited black male suffrage. His evolution was real, and it should be credited. But it was an evolution, not a fixed position, and the sanitized founding myth erases the journey in favor of a convenient ending. Crediting Lincoln only for the destination while ignoring the route is not history, it's a highlight reel. 16. You almost certainly believe Marco Polo returned from his legendary travels to China in the 13th century and brought back noodles, which eventually became Italian pasta. A charming story of culinary cross-pollination that appears in food history books, restaurant menus, and casual dinner table conversation as though it has been established. There is no evidence Marco Polo brought pasta to Italy. Italian pasta predates his return from China, and he was almost certainly not the vector, even if the chronology ran in the opposite direction. A Genoese soldier's will from 1279, the year before Marco Polo returned from his travels, includes a specific bequest of a basket of dried pasta described as macaroni, demonstrating that the food existed in Italy before his journey ended. Arabic geographers documented pasta being produced in Sicily as early as the 12th century, most likely introduced through Arab trade routes operating across the Mediterranean, not through any Asian connection. Marco Polo's own account, Il Milione, does mention noodle-like foods encountered in China, but does so in a way that implies comparison to something already familiar to his anticipated audience, not astonishment at discovering something entirely new. The specific story of Marco Polo importing pasta to Italy appears to have been invented or substantially embellished in a 1929 article published in the Macaroni Journal, a trade publication of the American pasta industry, as a marketing narrative designed to give the product a romantic origin story. Marco Polo's account is itself a complicated historical document. It was dictated to a professional romance writer while Polo was imprisoned in Genoa, and scholars have debated for centuries how much reflects first-hand experience versus embellishment or second-hand information from Persian and Arab merchants. The most famous food origin story in culinary history was invented by a pasta industry trade magazine. At least the pasta is real. 17. You know that Emperor Nero sat on a hilltop playing the fiddle while the Great Fire of 64 CE consumed Rome beneath him, the ultimate image of narcissistic, uncaring power. A ruler so consumed by his own performance that he turned catastrophe into an audience. Nero couldn't have played the fiddle because the fiddle didn't exist. The violin family of instruments wasn't developed until the 16th century, approximately 1500 years after Nero's death. Whatever Nero may or may not have done during the fire, it was not playing an instrument that wouldn't be invented for more than a millennium. The instrument Nero reportedly played was the cithara, a large lyre, which he genuinely did play and was reportedly proud of, performing publicly in ways that Roman aristocratic culture considered embarrassingly undignified for an emperor. The historian Tacitus, the most significant contemporary source on the fire of 64 CE, notes that Nero was at his villa in Antium, the modern city of Anzio, roughly 35 miles from Rome, when the fire started, and that he returned to the city to organize relief efforts. Tacitus acknowledges the rumors that Nero started the fire deliberately, but stops well short of endorsing them. He also records that Nero opened his own private estates and the Field of Mars as emergency shelter for citizens displaced by the blaze. The fire did conveniently clear substantial urban space that was subsequently incorporated into Nero's enormous palace complex, the Domus Aurea, which has kept the arson suspicion alive across 2,000 years of subsequent commentary. The scapegoating of Christians for the fire, documented by Tacitus, constitutes one of the earliest references to organized Christian persecution in Roman historical sources. Nero was a brutal and erratic ruler who didn't need an anachronistic instrument added to his biography. The truth was already damning enough. The myth just felt better on a poster. 18. You have been told that Niccolò Machiavelli wrote the definitive handbook for tyrants, a cold, amoral instruction manual for ruthless leadership that glorified cruelty, deception, and the complete absence of ethics in the pursuit of power, and that his name became an adjective meaning scheming and manipulative for very good reason. The problem is that Machiavelli was a committed Republican who had just been imprisoned and tortured by the regime he was ostensibly flattering when he wrote the book in question. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, immediately after being arrested, subjected to the strappado, and exiled by the Medici family, who had just retaken Florence and ended the Florentine Republic he had spent his career serving. Many serious scholars, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, have argued that The Prince is a sardonic exposure of how princes actually behave, rather than a sincere endorsement of those behaviors, written to warn citizens about the tactics rulers routinely deploy against them. Machiavelli's other major works, particularly the discourses on Livy, are explicitly and enthusiastically pro-republican, arguing at length that self-governing republics produce more stable, more just, and more durable societies than principalities ever could. He dedicated The Prince to Lorenzo de' Medici, partly in the hope of regaining political employment after his exile. The work functioned as much as a job application as a political treatise. It was not published during his lifetime. He died in 1527, and the book appeared in 1532. It was subsequently placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books, not the standard reception for a manual that powerful people found straightforwardly useful. The word Machiavellian was coined by his critics decades after his death, primarily churchmen offended by his separation of a political effectiveness from religious morality. The man whose name means cynical manipulation was a Republican who had just been tortured by the people he was supposedly advising. Either reading is uncomfortable, neither is the one you were taught. 19. You have recited the line your entire life, probably with some confidence, possibly in an argument you felt good about winning. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Albert Einstein. It appears on motivational posters, in therapy offices, in business presentations, and in the mouths of people who want to punctuate a point with borrowed genius. Einstein never said it, not once. There is no record of this statement in any of his writings, his letters, his documented speeches, or any verified conversation. The Albert Einstein Archives at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which holds the most comprehensive collection of his papers, has no record of it whatsoever. The earliest known written instance of the quote appears in recovery literature published by Narcotics Anonymous in 1981, 26 years after Einstein's death in 1955. It has also been attributed at various times to Benjamin Franklin, Mark Twain, and the novelist Rita Mae Brown, which is the characteristic signature of a homeless aphorism shopping for a famous name to attach itself to for credibility. As a factual claim about psychology, the quote is also misleading. Repeating an action and hoping for different results is sometimes entirely rational, particularly in probabilistic or experimental contexts where variation is inherent in the process. Quote, Investigator, an organization that systematically traces the origins of quotations, has documented dozens of statements misattributed to Einstein. The volume is large enough to constitute a separate body of work he never produced. Einstein said many genuinely remarkable things that are accurately sourced and considerably more interesting than anything on a motivational poster. They just don't compress as neatly into a single usable sentence. Einstein spent his life trying to understand the physical universe. In death, he's been conscripted into LinkedIn content. That may actually be the definition of something. 20. You believe Christopher Columbus was the first European to reach the Americas in 1492. The foundational act of the Age of Exploration, a historic first that defined the Western encounter with the New World and earned Columbus a holiday, statues, and the uncontested credit for one of history's most significant landfalls. Norse explorer Leif Erikson reached North America approximately 500 years before Columbus, established a settlement there, and the physical evidence for this is not ambiguous or contested. The Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, was discovered in 1960 by Helgi and Anne Ingstead, and has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 1000 CE, roughly 5 centuries before Columbus's 1492 voyage. L'Anse aux Meadows is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, representing confirmed excavated physical evidence of pre-Columbian European prisons on the North American continent. Norse sagas, specifically the Saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga, describe voyages by Leif Erikson and others to a land called Vinland, dismissed for centuries as legend and now confirmed by archaeology. Some historians argue for even earlier transatlantic contact, pointing to accounts of the 6th century Irish monk Saint Brendan, though physical evidence for that claim is absent. Columbus himself never set foot on the North American mainland at all. His landings were in the Caribbean, and across 4 complete voyages, he never reached the continent the holiday named after his achievement is celebrated on. The Columbus-centric narrative was aggressively promoted in 19th century America, particularly by Italian-American communities seeking a founding hero with European Catholic credentials, which is more identity politics than geography. Columbus gets the holiday, the statues, and the discovery credit for arriving 5 centuries after the Norse and never reaching the continent in question. If this were a race, he didn't finish in the top 10. 21. You have probably repeated the fact that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure visible from space with a naked eye. A claim so frequently stated with such casual confidence that it has achieved the status of universal common knowledge. The kind of thing you say at a party to sound informed and nobody questions. It is not visible from space with the naked eye, and this was being confidently asserted as fact long before any human being had actually reached space to verify it. The claim appears as early as 1932 in Ripley's Believe It or Not, over 2 decades before the space age began, which means nobody was checking before announcing it as settled science. The Great Wall averages approximately 15 to 30 feet in width, roughly comparable to a standard highway. At orbital distances, structures that narrow fall well below the resolution threshold of the unaided human eye, regardless of their length. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei, the first Chinese person to travel to space, specifically reported that he could not see the wall during his 2003 mission, a statement that prompted a notable national reassessment of the claim in Chinese school textbooks. NASA has confirmed that the wall is not visible to the naked eye from the International Space Station at its orbital altitude of roughly 250 miles. Photographs taken from orbit using high-powered cameras under optimal atmospheric conditions have captured it. But that is the camera performing, not the human eye. Many other man-made structures, including highways, airports, and reservoirs, are equally or more visible from orbit based on their surface dimensions and contrast with surrounding terrain. The Great Wall is one of the most extraordinary construction achievements in human history and required none of the space visibility myth to be impressive. Someone decided that thousands of miles long wasn't enough and added visible from orbit without asking an astronaut first. 22, you learned at some point that Niccolò Machiavelli was a cynical advocate for evil governance, but the deeper assumption underneath all the historical myths you carry is that the people who shaped Western political thought were more or less what their popular reputation say they were. That Cleopatra was Egyptian, that Columbus was first, that the Middle Ages were dark, because history settled these questions and the answers are in the books. Now consider what you actually know about Genghis Khan, a remorseless killing machine who built mountains of skulls where civilization stood and left nothing behind but rubble, fear, and a convenient symbol for pure destruction. Both halves of what you just read are partial truths that together produce a functional lie. The Mongol conquest caused population loss on a scale that is still difficult to fully comprehend. Estimates run into the tens of millions of deaths, and some regions of Persia and Central Asia lost the majority of their populations. The environmental and agricultural impact of that depopulation was measurable in data for centuries afterward, and simultaneously, Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, established formal protections for religious freedom across the empire at a time when European monarchs were launching crusades over theological differences. The Mongol Empire created the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability across the Silk Road that enabled unprecedented commercial and cultural exchange between Europe and Asia. He promoted administrators and generals based on demonstrated competence rather than hereditary rank, which was genuinely radical by medieval governance standards. He was illiterate and instituted a written language for Mongolian anyway, employing educated administrators from conquered peoples to run his empire. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in history while being responsible for some of the most extreme violence in the recorded past. He was not a cartoon villain. He was something considerably harder to categorize, which is why the cartoon has always been more convenient. 23, you carry the image of Florence Nightingale as a gentle, compassionate Victorian woman who walked hospital wards at night holding a lamp, bringing comfort to wounded soldiers through the quiet power of feminine care. The Lady with the Lamp, a soft monument to nursing as a vocation of warmth. Florence Nightingale was a statistician, a social reformer, and a political operative who restructured military and civilian hospital systems through rigorous data analysis at a time when most decision makers didn't know what a statistical graphic was. She pioneered the use of what she called polar area diagrams, now sometimes called Nightingale roses, to visualize mortality data from the Crimean War and demonstrate with measurable evidence that most soldiers were dying from preventable infections and poor sanitation, not from battlefield wounds. Her statistical work directly produced major sanitary reforms in British military and civilian hospitals. The data she compiled showed death rates falling from over 40% to approximately 2%. Following the implementation of sanitation improvements at the military hospital at Scutari. She lobbied Parliament directly, wrote extensively, and corresponded with government ministers for decades after the Crimean War, operating as a forceful policy advocate largely from her sickbed. She was housebound from the 1860s onward, likely due to brucellosis contracted during her time in Crimea. She founded the first secular nursing school at St. Thomas Hospital in London in 1860, professionalizing a field previously dominated by untrained and poorly regarded workers. She was elected the first female fellow of the Royal Statistical Society in 1858. The lamp image originated from a Times of London correspondence dispatches and was romanticized immediately upon publication, effectively burying the statistical and administrative work that actually drove the change she produced. Florence Nightingale saved soldiers' lives primarily by doing mathematics, and then using that mathematics to force institutional reform on a resistant military bureaucracy. History gave her a lamp. She deserved a spreadsheet and a lectern. 24, you know the quote. You have probably said it yourself, attributed it correctly, and felt reasonably certain about the source. Let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France, upon being told the peasants had no bread. It is the perfect encapsulation of aristocratic indifference, so perfectly calibrated to its historical moment that it has survived as the definitive example of ruling class obliviousness for over 2 centuries. Marie Antoinette almost certainly never said it, and the quote predates her meaningful involvement in French public life by years. The phrase, "let them eat brioche," qu'ils mangent de la brioche, appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765, when Marie Antoinette was approximately 9 or 10 years old and still living in Austria with no connection to the French court whatsoever. Rousseau attributes the remark to a great princess, not to Marie Antoinette specifically. Various other French royals and aristocrats have been proposed as the original speaker with no definitive attribution established. The specific attachment of the quote to Marie Antoinette appears to have solidified during and after the French Revolution, when she was the ideal villain for revolutionary propaganda. Austrian-born, visibly extravagant, and eventually executed. Contemporary scholarship on Marie Antoinette, including Antonia Fraser's biography, notes that she was more charitable than her reputation suggests and engaged in significant charitable giving, particularly during the grain shortages of 1788. The quote is such a structurally perfect encapsulation of aristocratic obliviousness that it became true by reputation rather than by documentation. It was too useful not to attach to her. Marie Antoinette was executed in 1793, partly for symbolizing everything the revolution opposed. History's most efficient addition to the case against her was a line she never delivered, attributed by people who needed her to be worse than the documented record made her. 25. You have absorbed the popular narrative of the War of Currents as a dramatic personal feud between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. 2 lone geniuses locked in ideological combat over the future of electrical power, a battle of personalities whose clash defined the age. The War of Currents was primarily a corporate infrastructure conflict between Edison General Electric and George Westinghouse's company, and Tesla's role in the popular mythology significantly overstates his personal antagonism with Edison while systematically erasing the figure who was actually central to the outcome. Tesla did work briefly for Edison in 1884 and 1885 and left acrimoniously, likely over a disputed payment for engineering work. Their relationship was short, soured, and then professionally irrelevant to both men for the rest of their careers. The primary combatants in the AC versus DC commercial war were the Edison and Westinghouse corporations. Tesla had sold his AC motor patents to George Westinghouse in 1888 for a lump sum in royalties. He was a crucial technological contributor, but Westinghouse was the business driver and financial engine behind AC's commercial push. Edison's infamous public campaign against alternating current, which included his team's highly publicized electrocution of animals using AC power, directly leading to the development of the electric chair, was a business strategy designed to protect his substantial DC infrastructure investments, not a personal vendetta against Tesla. The popular narrative of Edison as Tesla's great personal nemesis was substantially amplified by internet culture in the early 2010s, partly through viral content that contained significant historical inaccuracies. Westinghouse's AC system won the commercial contest decisively, demonstrated most visibly at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and the Niagara Falls Power Project. George Westinghouse, the most consequential figure in that outcome, almost never appears in the popular mythology. Businessmen rarely make the poster. 26. You think of Mahatma Gandhi as an unerringly principled spiritual leader whose philosophy of absolute non-violence made him the moral conscience of the 20th century. A secular saint in political clothing whose private convictions perfectly matched his celebrated public positions. Gandhi's views on race, particularly toward black Africans during his years in South Africa, were documented in his own writings and were explicitly derogatory in ways that the sainthood narrative simply cannot accommodate. Gandhi's early petitions and written materials in South Africa repeatedly described black Africans in severely demeaning terms and explicitly argued that Indian residents should not be classified alongside the people he referred to, using a racial slur that requires no euphemism. He used the word kafir directly. He sought separate legal treatment for Indians rather than solidarity with other non-white populations facing comparable discrimination. These statements were specific enough that the South African government erected a statue of Gandhi in Johannesburg in 2003, and several municipal councils subsequently voted to remove it in direct response to his documented historical record. Gandhi's nonviolence philosophy was specifically political rather than an absolute moral pacifism. He encouraged Indian men to serve in British military campaigns during the Boer War and World War I, believing military service would earn political recognition for the Indian population. His views on the caste system evolved slowly and unevenly, causing significant friction with figures like B.R. Ambedkar, who argued that Gandhi's approach preserved the fundamental structure he claimed to oppose. His personal practices, documented in his own writings and in subsequent biographical scholarship, have been described by historians as deeply inappropriate by any reasonable standard. None of this erases the significance of the independence movement he led or the genuine courage it required. It does, however, complicate the canonization of a human being into a figure whose biography has been made immune to examination. 27. You have probably repeated the claim that Nikola Tesla invented radio and that Guglielmo Marconi stole the credit. One of history's great intellectual thefts, a deliberate erasure of the true genius by a lesser man with better timing and more powerful allies. The history of radio's invention is a multi-person dispute involving several researchers working simultaneously across multiple countries. The United States Supreme Court issued a ruling in 1943 that has been selectively interpreted ever since, and neither Tesla invented it nor Marconi invented it fully captures what the historical and legal record actually shows. Marconi successfully transmitted the first transatlantic wireless signal in 1901 and received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909 for the development of wireless telegraphy. That work was real and consequential. Tesla held patents on key components of radio technology filed in the 1890s, which Marconi's subsequent work drew upon. The United States Patent Office initially granted Marconi's radio patents, then reversed several of them, citing Tesla's prior filings. In June of 1943, the Supreme Court ruled on a patent dispute related to Marconi's radio patents and determined that several key patents should be credited to Tesla and others. But this ruling was narrow, addressed specific patent claims, and was issued in June of that year, 5 months after Tesla's death in January. The ruling is frequently summarized online as, the Supreme Court said Tesla invented radio, which is a substantial overstatement of what the ruling actually said and what it legally established. Other researchers, including Oliver Lodge and Heinrich Hertz, made foundational contributions without which neither Marconi nor Tesla could have proceeded to any of their subsequent work. Marconi's Nobel Prize has never been revoked. Radio was invented by several people building incrementally on each other's work. The romantic version of stolen genius is a cleaner story. Most technology questions have the same messier answer. 28. You know Tutankhamun as one of ancient Egypt's great pharaohs, a powerful ruler whose legendary tomb and glittering golden treasures reflect a reign of supreme historical consequence and enduring influence over one of history's most formidable civilizations. Tutankhamun was a minor pharaoh who came to power at approximately 8 or 9 years of age, died at approximately 18 or 19, and was subsequently erased from official Egyptian records by his own successors. His global fame is entirely a product of archaeological luck, not historical significance. He ruled for roughly 10 years, from approximately 1332 to 1323 BCE, as a transitional figure in a period of considerable political instability following the reign of the religious reformer Akhenaten. His tomb, designated KV-62 in the Valley of the Kings, was discovered virtually intact by the British archaeologist Howard Carter in 1922, precisely because it was small, modestly positioned, and had been built over by later construction workers who obscured its entrance. Larger and more elaborate tombs belonging to considerably more powerful rulers had already been found and looted centuries earlier. The treasures inside were extraordinary, partly because of their remarkable preservation, not because Tutankhamun was unusually wealthy by the standards of Egyptian pharaohs. His principal political significance was reversing the religious reforms of Akhenaten, restoring polytheism and the cult of Amun. But this is generally credited to the senior advisors governing around him rather than to his own initiative. After his death, his successors, particularly the general Horemheb, systematically removed Tutankhamun's name from official monuments and transferred his recorded accomplishments to other rulers. He was effectively rediscovered by archaeology, not preserved by Egyptian historical tradition. Tutankhamun became the most famous pharaoh in history because a British archaeologist dug in the right place. Fame, it turns out, has a limited relationship with achievement. 29. You have probably quoted Winston Churchill on this subject without realizing you were quoting nobody in particular. History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. It is devastating, self-aware, and perfectly suited to Churchill's documented personality, a man who did in fact write extensively, who did win the Nobel Prize in Literature, and who unquestionably worked to shape how posterity would view him through his own published accounts. He never said it. There is no verified record of it in any of his writings, his verified speeches, or his documented private correspondence. The International Churchill Society, which maintains the most comprehensive record of Churchill's authenticated statements, has not verified this quote, and it does not appear in any of his published works. Churchill has become one of the most frequently misquoted figures in contemporary English language culture, functioning as a catch-all attribution for clever observations about war, courage, democracy, alcohol, and self-promotion. Other commonly misattributed Churchill statements include variations on "if you're going through hell, keep going," and the young liberal, old conservative formulation, neither of which has been verified in his writings. The specific quote about history being kind became widely circulated in the late 20th century, but has no traceable citation trail leading to an original source. Churchill was genuinely witty and left an enormous authenticated record of well-constructed statements, which paradoxically makes him a more appealing target for false attribution, because invented lines seem plausible alongside the real ones. Churchill was a prolific writer who shaped his own historical image through multi-volume memoirs and histories of World War II and the English-speaking peoples. He achieved the real version of what the fake quote describes, which is considerably less satisfying as a pithy quotation and considerably more interesting as a documented fact. He didn't need the invented line. He had already done the actual thing. 30. You were taught, and probably still believe, that Sigmund Freud established the scientific foundation upon which modern psychology and psychiatry rest, that his concepts of the unconscious, the ego, repression, and infantile sexuality are bedrock clinical science, and that his influence on understanding the human mind is the reason the discipline exists in its current form. The vast majority of Freud's specific clinical theories have been empirically disconfirmed or quietly abandoned by modern psychology and neuroscience, and his influence on contemporary clinical practice is marginal in proportion to his enormous cultural footprint. The specific claims of psychoanalytic theory, repressed memories generating neurosis, infantile sexuality as the organizing root of adult psychological pathology, dream interpretation as a reliable pathway to unconscious material, have not held up under controlled empirical testing. The modern Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the primary diagnostic reference for psychiatry, has progressively moved away from psychodynamic frameworks toward evidence-based behavioral and neurobiological models across successive editions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the most empirically validated psychological intervention across the broadest range of conditions, operates on fundamentally different theoretical principles from psychoanalysis. The scholar Friedrich Kruse and others have raised serious and documented questions about whether Freud fabricated or heavily embellished his famous case studies, the foundational clinical evidence for his theories. Freud's influence on literature, film, cultural theory, and the humanities remains substantial. His conceptual vocabulary entered the language and shaped intellectual life in ways that persist regardless of clinical validity. Freud was aware his work was speculative in places and actively resisted what he considered premature statistical evaluation, which his critics later noted had the effect of insulating his theory from meaningful disconfirmation. He invented a language for talking about the mind that proved generative for culture and essentially unworkable for medicine. He is simultaneously one of the 20th century's most influential thinkers and one of its most thoroughly dismantled scientists. 31, Ernesto Che Guevara primarily from his face, the Alberto Korda photograph, reproduced on more t-shirts than almost any other image in the history of commercial printing. As a revolutionary idealist whose iconic image represents resistance, liberation, and the romantic promise of radical transformation for people who have never read a word he wrote. Guevara personally oversaw hundreds of executions of political prisoners at La Cabaña prison in Havana following the Cuban Revolution's success in 1959, frequently without formal trials, and his own diaries and letters contain passages that are explicit about his view of violence as a necessary and generative instrument of revolution. As commander of La Cabaña, he was responsible for determining who was tried and executed. This is documented, not contested. A 1967 message he wrote encouraged guerrillas to develop hatred as an element of struggle in terms that required no interpretive reading. The iconic Korda photograph was taken in 1960. Its global proliferation began after Guevara's death in 1967 and owes as much to Italian publisher Giangiacomo Feltrinelli's mass reproduction of the image as to anything Guevara himself accomplished or represented. Guevara's post-Cuba revolutionary campaigns were failures. His 1965 Congo operation collapsed when he misread the local political conditions and alienated potential allies. His 1966-67 Bolivia campaign ended with his capture and execution by Bolivian forces acting with CIA assistance. His tenure as Cuba's National Bank president and industry minister produced notable economic decline by documented measures. The gap between the t-shirt and the documented record is not a matter of political interpretation. It is a matter of documented history being replaced by a photograph stripped of its context. Che Guevara's face became the world's most commercially reproduced protest symbol, sold by the corporations he claimed to oppose, worn by the class he claimed to despise. History occasionally produces the perfect irony. 32. You have repeated this one confidently. On the night of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere galloped through the Massachusetts countryside shouting, "The British are coming!" to warn the colonial militias, a heroic midnight ride that became one of America's defining dramatic origin stories and the template for a certain kind of principled, solitary courage. Revere almost certainly didn't shout, "The British are coming," because in April of 1775, that phrase would have been functionally incoherent to the people he was trying to warn, the overwhelming majority of whom considered themselves British subjects. Independence was not declared until July of 1776, 15 months later. Revere and the other riders were warning that the regulars are coming, or the redcoats are out, referring specifically to professional British Army troops being deployed, not to the general British population. Shouting, "The British are coming," at a crowd of British colonists would have been roughly as useful as shouting, "People are coming," at a crowd of people. Revere's own account of the ride, written in 1798, does not use the famous phrase. He describes warning people that the regulars are coming out, and notes that discretion was essential because secrecy was operationally critical to the mission. Revere was captured by British regulars during the ride and did not complete the journey to Concord. Two other riders, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, continued. It was Prescott who actually reached Concord. Dawes and Prescott are rarely mentioned in any popular account of the event. The famous phrase and the singular heroic narrative were cemented by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1860 poem, Paul Revere's Ride, written on the eve of the Civil War as a piece of patriotic motivation rather than accurate history. America's most famous midnight rider didn't finish the ride, didn't say the famous line, and split the mission with two other people history promptly forgot. The poem was better. The poem is not the history. 33. You may believe that King Arthur was a real historical figure, a Romano-British warlord whose legend was embellished by medieval writers, but whose core existence anchored the mythology, a genuine man beneath the literary accumulation of Camelot, the Round Table, Guinevere, and the Sword in the Stone. There is no contemporary historical evidence for a figure matching the Arthurian legend. The historical Arthur hypothesis is actively contested among medievalists, and the romantic King Arthur that lives in Western cultural memory was constructed almost entirely by medieval French literature, not preserved from a real historical source. The earliest references to Arthur appear in Welsh texts, and in the 9th century Historia Brittonum attributed to Nennius, written approximately 300 years after the period in which Arthur supposedly lived in the 5th and 6th centuries CE. No contemporary Roman, British, or Saxon source from that period mentions him. The elaborate mythology, Camelot, Lancelot, the Holy Grail, the Round Table, was largely invented by the French writer Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century and expanded by subsequent medieval authors. These elements do not exist in the earlier Welsh sources at all. Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, published in 1485 and the version most familiar to English readers, was written nearly 1,000 years after Arthur supposedly lived. Multiple candidates have been proposed as the historical figure underlying the legend: Riothamus, Ambrosius Aurelianus, Owain Dantgwyn, and none has achieved scholarly consensus. Glastonbury Abbey conveniently announced the discovery of Arthur's grave in 1191, shortly after a fire destroyed the buildings that generated their pilgrimage revenue. The most famous king in British history almost certainly never existed. British national identity absorbed a fictional character authored primarily by a 12th century French writer as its founding heroic myth. If that doesn't explain something important about the British relationship with their own history, nothing will. 34. You learn that Charles Dickens was the tireless progressive champion of the Victorian poor. A man whose private life matched the compassion of his public fiction, whose personal conduct embodied the values of generosity and social conscience that his novels preached to an entire civilization. Dickens' treatment of his wife, Catherine Hogarth, the mother of his 10 children and his partner of 22 years, was, by any reasonable standard, cruel and deliberately destructive to her reputation and social standing. In 1858, Dickens separated from Catherine after beginning a relationship with the actress Ellen Ternan, who was 18 years old to his 45. He attempted to have Catherine placed in a mental institution before settling on separation. After the split, he published a self-exculpatory statement in his own magazine, placed the blame for the marriage's failure entirely on Catherine, and used his considerable public platform to effectively cut her off from London's social life. Their children were largely kept from her. Dickens maintained the relationship with Ternan for the remainder of his life and went to considerable lengths to conceal it, destroying thousands of letters and instructing associates to do the same. He was, by documented accounts, a domineering domestic presence who expected his household to organize entirely around his writing schedule and was described by his own children as emotionally remote and demanding. Claire Tomalin's biography, The Invisible Woman, published in 1990, documented the Ternan relationship comprehensively using archival sources. Dickens' advocacy for the poor was entirely genuine and produced literature that influenced legislation, That is not in question. It coexisted with an inability to extend comparable consideration to the most vulnerable person in his immediate household. He wrote the most famous fictional meditation on Christmas generosity in the English language while conducting a concealed long-term affair and methodically dismantling his wife's reputation. The Ghost of Christmas Past would have had substantial material to work with. 35. You grew up learning that the moss on a tree grows only on the north side, giving you a reliable natural compass if you ever found yourself lost in the wilderness. A piece of folk wisdom so widely repeated across survival guides, scout manuals, and casual outdoor advice that questioning it feels almost rude. Moss does not reliably grow on the north side of trees, and navigating by it will not get you home. It will get you walking in progressively confident circles until the rescue teams arrive. Moss grows where conditions favor it: cool shade and consistent moisture. In the northern hemisphere, the north-facing side of a tree does receive slightly less direct sunlight, which can create marginally cooler and damper conditions. But in a wet environment, moss will colonize every surface available regardless of compass orientation. A damp forest will show you moss blanketing trees from the south, east, west, and every diagonal between them with complete botanical indifference to your navigational needs. The assumption that nature organizes itself around magnetic north for your convenience is the kind of thinking that gets people lost in progressively worse ways. The moss navigation myth belongs to the same category of survival folklore that sounds authoritative in a living room and becomes a liability outdoors. Real wilderness navigation requires a compass, a map, or knowledge of actual celestial navigation, the sun's arc, the position of stars, none of which require consulting the opinions of a plant. The myth persists because it has the feel of ancient, tested wisdom, the kind of knowledge passed down through generations of people who presumably survived to pass it on. What gets left out of that transmission is the number of people who trusted the moss, walked confidently in the wrong direction, and were not available to correct the record afterward. Trusting a plant's real estate preferences to guide you home is volunteering to get lost with extra steps. 36. You know that Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz had a famous dispute over who invented calculus. A straightforward priority argument between two brilliant rivals that history eventually settled in Newton's favor. A clean story of contested genius and institutional judgment. The calculus dispute was one of the most bitter, nationalistic, and mathematically consequential controversies in the history of science. And Newton's personal conduct during it was, by any reasonable assessment, a serious breach of the integrity he is credited with embodying. Newton developed the core ideas of calculus in the mid-1660s, but published almost nothing about them for decades. Leibniz independently developed calculus in the 1670s and published first in 1684 and 1686. The public controversy exploded in the early 18th century. In 1713, the Royal Society published a report finding decisively in Newton's favor. A report that Newton himself secretly wrote or heavily directed while simultaneously presenting it to the public as the conclusion of an independent investigating body. He was the president of the Royal Society at the time. The dispute became ferociously nationalistic almost immediately. British mathematicians defended Newton, continental mathematicians defended Leibniz, and the two camps reduced their professional communication to near zero for decades. This had serious lasting consequences. British mathematics fell significantly behind continental developments for over a century, partly because British practitioners adhered to Newton's notation rather than adopting Leibniz's, which is what every calculus student in the world learns and uses today. The di over dx, the integral sign, the entire notational architecture of modern calculus is Leibniz's. Leibniz died in 1716 in political disfavor, his royal patron recently deceased, and virtually no one attended his funeral. Newton invented calculus, refused to publish it for 20 years, watched someone else publish independently, and then used his institutional authority to rule in his own favor. Leibniz's notation won anyway. Institutional power is shorter than it thinks. 37. You have absorbed the framing, probably from school, from documentaries, from the general cultural atmosphere, that the Middle Ages were 1,000 years of intellectual stagnation, superstition, unchecked religious tyranny, and grinding ignorance, sandwiched between the glory of ancient Rome and the awakening of the Renaissance. The term Dark Ages is not a historical assessment. It is a marketing slogan invented by Renaissance scholars to make themselves look better by comparison, and it has been doing that job unchallenged for approximately 600 years. Italian humanist scholars of the 14th and 15th centuries coined the term retroactively to contrast their own era favorably against the preceding centuries. They needed a dark backdrop against which their own achievements would appear luminous. It worked. Medieval scholars preserved, copied, translated, and actively debated ancient Greek and Roman texts throughout the period its detractors called dark. The Islamic world played a central role in transmitting and substantially expanding classical knowledge, which re-entered European intellectual life through translation centers in Spain and Sicily. The medieval period produced the university as an institutional form, Bologna in 1088, Oxford around 1096, Cambridge in 1209. It produced Gothic cathedral architecture, the Magna Carta in 1215, common law legal systems, the mechanical clock, and advanced agricultural and metallurgical technologies that provided the material conditions for everything that came after. Medieval philosophers including Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and Roger Bacon engaged in rigorous systematic argument that directly prepared the conceptual ground for the scientific revolution. The period was also genuinely brutal in many respects. Plague, endemic warfare, serfdom, and organized religious violence were real features of medieval life. But brutal and intellectually dormant are not the same condition, and a millennium of human civilization has been casually dismissed by conflating them. The Middle Ages were labeled dark by the people who came immediately after and needed to feel superior to their predecessors. Every generation does this. That one just had better branding. 38, you may know that Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, mother of Elizabeth I, and one of the most written about women in English history, had 6 fingers on one hand, a physical detail frequently cited in connection with the witchcraft accusations that surrounded her and that contributed to her downfall and execution. No reliable contemporary source documents Anne Boleyn having 6 fingers. The claim originates in Catholic polemical literature written by her enemies decades after her death and has been treated as biographical fact despite having no foundation in any primary record. The earliest written account of the 6th finger comes from Nicholas Sanders' Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism, published in 1585, 49 years after Anne's execution in 1536. Sander was a Catholic polemicist writing in exile, working explicitly to discredit the Protestant English crown and delegitimize Elizabeth by attacking her mother's reputation and character. His account also describes Anne as having a large cyst under her chin, a projecting tooth, and a sallow complexion. A catalogue of physical imperfections that functions as deliberate character demolition rather than biographical documentation. Contemporary portraits of Anne, including the most widely accepted surviving likeness, show no visible hand deformity. Court portraiture of the Tudor era idealized its subjects, but would not routinely conceal a visible supernumerary digit across every surviving image. Anne was known during her lifetime for her French-educated elegance, her musical accomplishment, and her prominent role in court culture. Descriptions that sit poorly with a conspicuous physical anomaly. The polydactyly detail survived because it added supernatural texture to a story that already carried charges of witchcraft in popular memory, even though witchcraft was not formally among the charges at her actual trial. Adultery and treason were. One hostile source, written half a century after her death by a man paid to damage her reputation, has appeared in more historical novels than any primary evidence. This is how legend reliably defeats biography. 39. You know the story of Mozart's death and burial as one of history's most poignant images of neglected genius. A supreme musical talent dying destitute, cast into an unmarked mass grave, abandoned by the wealthy patrons he had entertained, forgotten by the city he had enriched, his body mingling anonymously with strangers in a pauper's pit while the world moved on without pausing to mark his passing. Mozart was not buried in a pauper's mass grave. He received a standard third-class funeral that was entirely common for Viennese citizens of his income level, and in 1791 it was not only common but actively fashionable in Vienna to have modest funerals, including among the wealthy. Emperor Joseph II had introduced deliberate burial reforms in 1784, specifically discouraging elaborate funeral rituals and encouraging simple interment as a matter of civic policy and public hygiene. Many middle-class citizens and even some aristocrats were buried under these reformed conditions. It carried no social stigma and no implication of poverty or dishonor. Mozart's third-class burial would have included a coffin, a blessing, and interment in the general cemetery at St. Mark's. The cemetery did not use individual grave markers for any burial category except the most expensive. This was standard administrative practice across the city, not a specific comment on Mozart's standing. At the time of his death, Mozart was not destitute. He had recently received a well-compensated appointment as imperial chamber composer and had realistic income prospects. He carried debts, which was unremarkable among artists of the era. The location of his grave was not tracked because no one tracking such things anticipated that documentation would later be required. An administrative gap, not an expression of indifference to his importance. The romantic pauper's grave narrative was substantially developed in the 19th century to serve the Romantic movement's appetite for tragic genius stories. Mozart was buried, like most middle-class Viennese people of his time, in accordance with the civic death reform policies then in fashion. 40, you may have heard, particularly in discussions of medieval trade and exploration, that Marco Polo spent 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan, returned to Europe with transformative knowledge of the East, and produced in Il Milione the foundational Western document of direct engagement with China. An eyewitness account from the most consequential traveler of the medieval period. A significant and serious body of scholarship has raised the question of whether Marco Polo actually visited China at all, or whether his account was assembled from existing Persian and Arab travel literature, merchant reports, and geographic texts without his ever having crossed into the country he described. Polo's account notably omits features of Chinese civilization that would have been functionally impossible to miss across 17 years of residence. The Great Wall, the practice of foot binding, the Chinese writing system, tea, which was ubiquitous throughout Chinese social life, chopsticks, and Chinese printing technology. Chinese records from the Yuan dynasty, which was meticulous in documenting foreign dignitaries and officials present at the imperial court, contain no reference to a Marco Polo or any identifiable equivalent in any archive that has been examined. Il Milione was dictated to a professional romance writer named Rustichello da Pisa, while Polo was imprisoned in Genoa following a naval battle. Rustichello was known for embellishing travel accounts, and the collaborative nature of the text considerably complicates its reliability as straightforward first-hand testimony. The historian Frances Wood argued the case against Polo's Chinese visit in her 1995 book, Did Marco Polo Go to China?, citing the omissions and the archival silence. Other scholars have defended the account, noting that Yuan dynasty records are incomplete and that some details Polo provides are accurate in ways that would be difficult to fabricate. Polo reportedly declined on his deathbed to recant any exaggerations, stating he had not told half of what he saw. That is either the statement of a truthful witness or an exceptionally committed storyteller, and history has never fully settled which. 41. You know Richard the Lionheart as the paradigmatic English hero king. Brave, chivalric, a crusader who embodied the finest qualities of English national character, a ruler who genuinely cared for and was beloved by his people. the standard against which subsequent English monarchs have been measured and usually found wanting. Richard the Ardine spent approximately 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, almost certainly could not speak English, and regarded the country primarily as a source of revenue to underwrite his military campaigns abroad. He ruled England from 1189 to 1199. Across those 10 years, 6 months total on English soil is a conservative estimate, less time in residence than almost any monarch before or since. His mother tongue was Occitan, the language of southern France, and he was raised and educated in Aquitaine. He communicated in French and Latin. There is no credible evidence that he spoke English. When he needed to raise money for the Third Crusade, he made a statement that has been preserved in the historical record. He said he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. He sold charters, administrative offices, and legal privileges throughout England in order to fund his campaigns. His prolonged absence left England to be governed by regents whose competition for authority destabilized the realm, eventually creating the conditions that produced his brother John as a governing presence, the villain of the Robin Hood tradition, and the political pressures that would lead to Magna Carta under John's subsequent reign. Richard's military reputation is genuinely deserved. He was an exceptional battlefield commander whose performance at Arsuf and during the Crusade sieges was remarkable by the standards of any era. The romantic English hero king image was constructed primarily in the 19th century by writers including Sir Walter Scott, who needed a chivalric founding myth for an era that required one. England's greatest legendary hero couldn't speak English and spent a decade fighting in the Middle East and France. The English have always had a complicated relationship with Europe. 42. You probably carry the assumption that Isaac Newton was a devout, conventional Christian whose faith and science coexisted in productive harmony. A model of the religiously committed scientist, a man whose monumental work in mathematics and physics represented the rational investigation of a divinely ordered universe in ways perfectly consistent with orthodox belief. Newton was secretly a heretic whose private theological convictions were so far outside the boundaries of legal orthodoxy that their exposure would have cost him his Cambridge fellowship and potentially constituted a criminal offense under English law. He wrote over 1 million words on theology, substantially more than he wrote on physics and mathematics combined. These writings remained largely unpublished until the 20th century, when their full scope became apparent. Newton was an anti-Trinitarian. He rejected the doctrine of the Holy Trinity as a corruption introduced into Christianity at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. And he dedicated significant scholarly effort to demonstrating that the original uncorrupted Christian texts did not support the Trinitarian formulation. Under English law, anti-Trinitarianism was a heresy, and Newton concealed this conviction throughout his life with considerable care. He also spent years as a serious practicing alchemist, conducting systematic chemical experiments in pursuit of knowledge he believed was encoded in ancient texts. Not as a credulous eccentric, but as a methodical researcher applying the same systematic attention he brought to his mathematical work. He was further consumed by the Book of Revelation and the architecture of the Temple of Solomon, writing detailed analyses he believed encoded the timeline of human history. John Maynard Keynes, who purchased a substantial collection of Newton's private papers at auction in 1936, described him not as the first figure of the Age of Reason, but as the last of the magicians. Newton spent half his intellectual life on heresy, alchemy, and biblical prophecy, and became history's poster figure for rational, conventional Christian science. He kept his actual views secret because they were illegal. The history of science then kept them secret for another 2 centuries because they were inconvenient. 43, you think of Abraham Lincoln's legal career as part of the frontier genius mythology. The self-made man who taught himself the law from borrowed books by firelight in a log cabin and became a formidable attorney through sheer natural brilliance. An autodidact whose informal education was itself evidence of the democratic promise he would later embody as president. Lincoln was genuinely self-taught in law, but the frontier amateur image systematically obscures what was, by any objective professional measure, an exceptionally rigorous and commercially successful legal practice conducted over nearly 25 years. Lincoln practiced law in Illinois from 1836 to 1861, 25 years during which the Lincoln Legal Papers Project has documented approximately 5,100 individual cases. He appeared before the Illinois Supreme Court in over 400 of them. A volume of Supreme Court appearances at that level requires systematic preparation, deep procedural knowledge, and a durable professional reputation, none of which are consistent with the image of a colorful frontier amateur operating on charm and instinct. Lincoln traveled the Illinois 8th Judicial Circuit twice annually with other lawyers and judges, covering roughly 400 miles and stopping at courthouses throughout central Illinois. This was a demanding professional routine, not an occasional hobby. He handled significant corporate clients including the Illinois Central Railroad, complex litigation requiring considerable technical sophistication in an era when railroad law was actively being developed. His income from legal practice was substantial. By the 1850s, he was earning several $1,000s per year, a comfortable professional income derived primarily from law rather than from politics. The log cabin, firelight, Blackstone's commentaries image is partly accurate. He did read foundational legal texts independently. But the lawyer produced by that education was not a rustic amateur. He was a rigorous professional with 5,100 documented cases. History kept the firelight. It left out the other 5,000 cases because they were harder to put on a monument. 44, you have been told, and the image is vivid enough that you have probably never questioned it, that the medieval period believed in a flat earth, that ordinary people and the institutional church alike were certain the world was a disk, and that ships sailing too far from shore would fall off the edge into oblivion, a belief that Columbus and other explorers heroically defied. Educated Europeans in the medieval period knew the earth was spherical. This was not a secret. It was not disputed. It was standard knowledge taught in universities, referenced in theological texts, and accepted across the educated classes of medieval Europe without meaningful controversy. Greek mathematician Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy around 240 BCE, nearly 1,700 years before Columbus sailed. Medieval scholars, including Thomas Aquinas, explicitly referenced a spherical Earth. The Church's position was not flat Earth belief. Medieval theologians worked within a cosmological framework inherited from ancient Greek scholarship that placed a spherical Earth at the center of a series of celestial spheres. The flat Earth medieval myth was substantially invented in the 19th century. Washington Irving's 1828 fictionalized biography of Columbus fabricated dramatic opposition from flat Earth believers to make Columbus's story more heroic. 19th century advocates for scientific progress then adopted the flat Earth medieval narrative as a useful historical villain, casting the church as the opponent of enlightened geographical knowledge in order to position science as its liberating successor. The actual debate Columbus faced was not about the shape of the Earth, but about the size of the ocean. His critics correctly believed the distance to Asia by sailing west was too great to survive. Columbus was wrong about the distance and survived only because an uncharted landmass intervened. The medieval church believed in a spherical Earth for 1,000 years before anyone needed to defend Columbus's reputation, and no one thought to mention it because it wasn't interesting enough to be worth lying about. 45. You know that Paul Revere's ride is one of America's founding dramatic stories. But go back to item 32, because what comes after the ride is a myth in its own right that operates independently and deserves its own examination. Consider instead what you believe about Benjamin Franklin, that he flew a kite in a thunderstorm, got struck by lightning, and discovered electricity, a singular act of American ingenuity that placed him among history's great scientists and gave the modern world one of its foundational insights. Franklin didn't discover electricity. Electrical phenomena had been observed and documented since ancient times. William Gilbert coined the term electricity in 1600. By Franklin's era in the 1740s and 1750s, there was an active and productive European scientific community studying electrostatics in detail. Franklin's actual contributions were specific and genuinely significant. He demonstrated that lightning was electrical in nature, developed influential theoretical frameworks around positive and negative charge, and invented the lightning rod, a practical device that prevented an enormous number of building fires and deaths across 2 centuries of subsequent use. The famous kite experiment of 1752 was not directly witnessed by any verified independent observer, which has led some historians to question whether Franklin personally conducted it precisely as described or extrapolated from smaller-scale experiments and the accounts of others. A French scientist, Thomas François Dalibard, conducted a documented and witnessed version of Franklin's proposed lightning experiment in France in May of 1752, before Franklin's version appears in the historical record. Franklin never claimed to have discovered electricity and would likely have found the assertion puzzling. His political and diplomatic career was arguably as consequential as his scientific one. He was central to the Declaration of Independence, negotiated the French alliance during the Revolution, and helped shape the Constitution. He didn't light up the world. He figured out how to stop lightning from burning buildings down, which was more useful and considerably less dramatic as a story. 46, you carry the assumption, absorbed so gradually it feels like basic knowledge that the Salem witch trial victims were burned at the stake. The iconic image of Puritan religious hysteria and persecution that has defined the visual language of witch trials in Western popular culture, appearing in films, novels, Halloween decorations, and the general iconographic shorthand for religious extremism destroying innocent lives. No one was burned at the stake in Salem, not one person. The 19 people executed during the Salem witch trials of 1692 were hanged, at a site now identified as Proctor's Ledge in Salem, Massachusetts. One additional man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death over the course of 2 days after he refused to enter a plea, with heavy stones placed on his chest in an attempt to force a legal response. His reported final words were, "More weight." Several others died in prison while awaiting trial. The burning at the stake imagery belongs overwhelmingly to continental European witch trials and to the Scottish witch persecutions, where burning, often combined with prior strangulation, was the legally prescribed method of execution. English legal tradition, which the Massachusetts Bay Colony followed, used hanging. The Salem trials were relatively brief, running from 1692 into 1693, and modest in their scale compared to the continental European persecutions, in which tens of thousands of people were executed by burning across the 14th through 18th centuries. The cultural conflation of burning in Salem likely comes from that much larger, longer-running, and genuinely more expansive European persecution being compressed into a single stock image of fire and applied uniformly backward. This error doesn't just misrepresent what happened in Salem, it also obscures the far larger and more geographically extensive European persecutions by flattening the entire history of witch trial executions into one image that belongs to neither accurately. Salem's victims were hanged. The fire exists only in the myth. 47. You may believe that the discoveries and achievements attributed to famous scientists, explorers, rulers, and thinkers across history are primarily the products of individual brilliance operating in relative isolation. That Newton sat alone with his mathematics, that Darwin sailed alone with his observations, that Curie worked alone with her radioactive materials, and that the story of human progress is essentially a parade of exceptional individuals whose singular contributions drove civilization forward while everyone else watched. That framing, sometimes called the great man theory of history, was formalized by the Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle in his 1840 lectures on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history, and it has been systematically and repeatedly challenged by historians for over a century. Herbert Spencer challenged it immediately, noting that great individuals are themselves products of the social and material conditions that form them. Every achievement in this list that has been attributed to a lone genius was enabled by networks of predecessors, contemporaries, assistants, and institutional frameworks. Newton built on Kepler, Galileo, and Hooke. Darwin co-developed with Wallace and was supported by Lyell, Hooker, and Huxley. Edison worked through a large team at Menlo Park. Lincoln governed through a cabinet he deliberately populated with political rivals. The unnamed women, enslaved people, colonized populations, and working-class laborers whose labor created the material conditions for famous historical actors to operate are systematically invisible in great man accounts. The theory also distorts causation. It implies that removing one individual would have prevented major historical developments, when most such developments were products of structural conditions that would have found expression through someone. Modern historiography, social history, economic history, the history of marginalized groups, has demonstrated repeatedly that historical change emerges from complex multi-causal processes. 46 myths about 46 famous individuals, and the frame that produced every single one of them is itself the largest myth on the list. 48, you know Catherine the Great of Russia primarily through two things: her remarkable reign and a story about the manner of her death that is so spectacularly specific, so perfectly calibrated to simultaneously fascinate and humiliate a powerful woman, that it has circulated as whispered historical fact for over 2 centuries in every language that knows her name. Catherine the Great died of a stroke. She collapsed on November 5th, 1796, fell into unconsciousness, and died the following day of what contemporaries and modern medical assessors agree was a cerebral hemorrhage. She was 67 years old. The story attached to her death, involving a horse and a situation that requires no further elaboration given how thoroughly it has already traveled, has no basis in any contemporaneous account. Court records document she collapsed near her dressing room. No horse was present in any description from anyone who was actually there. The myth appears to have originated in Prussian and French political pamphlets distributed during her reign, a standard tool of the era for attacking powerful women by sexualizing them beyond the boundaries of plausibility, thereby rendering their authority ridiculous by association. Catherine was the target of extensive propaganda throughout her reign, specifically because she was a woman exercising autocratic authority in a male political world, and because she had multiple well-documented romantic relationships, the kind of personal history that male rulers of the same era enjoyed without generating equivalent commentary. She was by any historical measure one of the most significant rulers in Russian history. She expanded Russian territory dramatically, patronized Enlightenment philosophy and art, maintained extensive correspondence with Voltaire and Diderot, and founded institutions including what eventually became the Hermitage Museum. The persistence of a fabricated sexual scandal across 2.5 centuries, while her actual accomplishments required deliberate effort to recall, is not a quirk of popular memory. It is a case study in how slander against women in power operates across time. She deserved better. So does anyone who has repeated it thinking they were sharing history. 49. You know that Cleopatra was one of antiquity's most powerful and sophisticated rulers, that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon with famous decisiveness, that Nero played an impossible instrument during a fire he may not have started, and by now, you have been through 48 of these. Which means the question worth sitting with is not which specific detail was wrong, but why the pattern exists at all. Consider what you believe about the medieval period more broadly. Not just the flat earth myth already addressed, but the general assumption that figures from the distant past were simpler, more credulous, more limited than people living now. That the gap between then and now is a gap in basic human capacity, rather than in available technology and accumulated information. This assumption is itself a myth with a specific origin. The scholar David Hume wrote in the 18th century that people tend to admire antiquity and despise the immediate past, producing a cyclical mythology in which each era positions itself as the enlightened corrective to whatever came before. The Renaissance invented the Dark Ages. The Enlightenment invented the superstitious medieval peasant. The 19th century invented the lone heroic genius. The 21st century inherited all three and added the internet, which accelerated the distribution of all of them simultaneously. Every myth in this list exists because someone needed a simpler story. Needed Napoleon small, needed Newton struck by an apple, needed Curie oblivious, needed the Middle Ages dark. Because the simpler story served a function. It made the present feel more enlightened by comparison, or made a patron look more legitimate, or sold a product, or won an argument. The people those myths were built about were not simpler. They were not more credulous. They were operating with different information in different conditions, making decisions that were rational within those constraints. The myth is rarely about them. It is almost always about the person who needed it. 50. You have spent this entire video being told what is wrong, which historical figure's reputation was manufactured, which famous quote was invented, which foundational story was constructed after the fact for someone else's purposes. That is useful information. It is also, if you are not careful, its own kind of trap. The corrective to myth is not automatic skepticism applied to everything with equal force. That produces a different kind of distortion, one where nothing can be trusted, and the absence of certainty becomes a reason to dismiss rather than investigate. The corrective to myth is the discipline of asking where a specific belief comes from, who documented it and when, what the primary sources actually say, as opposed to what the secondary sources say they say, and whose interests were served by the version that became dominant. Marie Curie's notebooks are radioactive and stored in lead boxes. That is a primary source you can visit. Lincoln's 5 handwritten drafts of the Gettysburg Address exist and are studied by scholars. That is a primary source you can access. The surviving skeletal remains of Richard III were examined by forensic scientists whose methodology is publicly documented. That is a primary source with an audit trail. The difference between a myth and a documented fact is not always obvious from a casual position, but the trail from one to the other is usually findable if you are willing to follow it past the version that was satisfying enough to stop spreading before anyone checked. 49 items. 49 beliefs you carried with more confidence than the evidence warranted. The question is not whether you believe them. Everyone did. The myths were designed to be believed. The question is what you do with the corrected information, whether you update and move forward, or whether you find a reason the original version was right after all. One of those responses has a name. It was falsely attributed to Einstein. You know the one. 51. You have now sat through the complete demolition of 50 carefully selected myths about famous historical figures, and if the great man theory is itself the final myth, the frame that produced all the others, then the honest conclusion is not that famous historical figures were frauds or that their achievements were invented. Newton's mathematics are real. Curie's radioactivity research transformed physics and medicine. Lincoln preserved the Union and signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Darwin produced one of the most evidentially supported theories in the history of science. The achievements are real. What is false is the mythology layered over those achievements. The apple that hit a head, the envelope on the train, the oblivious woman with the test tubes, the man who single-handedly outthought an entire field without predecessors or collaborators. That layering serves a function. It makes the achievements feel more dramatic, more singular, more accessible as a narrative. But it does so at the cost of what actually happened, which is invariably more interesting and considerably more instructive. The actual history of how Newton's gravitational theory developed, through decades of mathematics, prior work by multiple scholars, a bitter dispute over credit, and a compromised investigation, tells you something real and useful about how science operates as a human institution. The mythology tells you that genius arrives fully formed in the form of falling fruit, which is entertaining and teaches you nothing you can use. You now know which stories were fabricated, who fabricated them, and roughly what they were fabricated to accomplish. The question is whether that knowledge changes anything. Whether you correct the record when the myths come up in conversation, or whether the myth persists because it is shorter and easier, and the corrected version requires more than 30 seconds to explain. History is not a collection of stories, it is a record of what actually happened. The two overlap less than you were told. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.